For 200 years, humanity kept its head down and its mouth shut, and the galaxy mistook their silence for weakness. It was the year 2347, and Earth was just another minor member of the Galactic Concord, an alliance of over 4,000 species that stretched across 100,000 star systems. And in all that vastness, humans were considered barely worth noticing, too young, too emotional, too short-lived, and far too fragile to matter in the grand game of empires. Ambassador Idris Okonkwo knew this better than anyone, because he had spent the last 23 years sitting in the Great Hall of the Concord on a station called Unity Prime, surrounded by alien delegates who looked through him like he was made of glass. And every single time he rose to speak, the whispers would begin. There goes the human again, always so loud, always so desperate, always asking for things he doesn't understand. But Okonkwo was not a fool, and he was not weak. Patient and patience, as any human could tell you, was not the same thing as surrender. The trouble had started long before his time, long before Earth had even joined the Concord, because there was a power in the galaxy that everyone feared and nobody challenged. A vast and ancient empire called the Draven Hegemony, ruled by a being known as High Sovereign Jalvor, who had held his throne for over 900 years and had never once known defeat. The Draven were conquerors. That was simply what they were, the way a river is water and a star is fire. And over the centuries, they had swallowed world after world, species after species, bending them into submission or breaking them entirely. And the Galactic Concord had watched it happen every single time and done absolutely nothing, because the Draven were too powerful and war was too expensive, and it was always easier to look away. Okonkwo had begged them not to look away. He had stood in that great hall dozens of times and pointed at the star maps and said the words that everyone already knew but refused to speak out loud. They are coming for all of us, and if we do not stand together now, we will fall alone later. But the other delegates would shake their heads or their tentacles or whatever they had, and they would say the same thing they always said. You are young, Ambassador. You do not understand how the galaxy works. The Draven take what they want, and then they stop. It has always been this way. It will always be this way, and trying to change it will only bring ruin. And so the galaxy did nothing, while the Draven moved closer and closer to human space, annexing border worlds, consuming smaller civilizations, growing fatter and bolder with every system they took. Then came the day that changed everything. It arrived in the form of a message, cold, formal, and absolute, delivered by a Draven envoy to the human embassy on Unity Prime. And it said this: Draven Hegemony claims sovereign right over the human colony worlds of Argos, New Carthage, and Meridian. All human citizens will vacate these worlds within 30 standard days. Failure to comply will be met with overwhelming force. There will be no negotiation. Okonkwo read the message 3 times, and each time his hands were steady, and each time his heart beat a little harder, not with fear, but with something older and deeper, something that every human carried in their blood like a second pulse, something the galaxy had never seen, because humanity had never had a reason to show it. He walked into the Great Hall one final time, and for once the chamber was silent, because every species in the Concord already knew what the Draven had demanded, and every single one of them expected the humans to do what everyone else had always done: comply, retreat, survive. Okonkwo stood at the podium and looked out at 4,000 species and said 5 words that would echo across the stars for centuries to come: We will not kneel down. The silence that followed was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of shock. Because no one said no to the Draven. No one, not in 1,000 years. Here was this fragile, short-lived creature from a small blue world, standing in front of the most powerful gathering in the galaxy, and choosing war over submission. Several delegates tried to intervene. The Valori ambassador urged caution. The Tessic trade minister warned of economic ruin, and a dozen others offered to mediate, but Okonkwo simply shook his head and said, "We have spent 200 years asking you to do the right thing, and you would not. So now we will do it ourselves, and may history judge us all for the choices we make today." He left the hall, and he did not look back. 8,000 light-years away, on a warship orbiting the dark side of Titan, Admiral Corin Vasquez received the message she had been preparing for her entire career. Not hoping for, not wanting, but preparing for, because that was what humans did. They prepared for the worst while hoping for the best, and when the worst finally came, they were ready. Years old, born on Mars, raised in the shipyards of Callisto, and she had never fired a weapon in combat. Not once in 38 years of service. Because humanity had never gone to war with another species, and there were those who believed that meant humans could not fight. Those people were about to learn how wrong they were. Vasquez opened a sealed file on her command console, a file that had been passed down from admiral to admiral for over a century, updated and refined by every generation, a file that bore a simple label: Contingency Prometheus. She read it carefully, though she already knew every word by heart, because she had studied it, trained for it, and dreamed about it in the dark hours of every restless night for decades. And when she was done reading, she closed the file and looked at her executive officer, Captain Dae-jung Park, who stood waiting with the same quiet readiness that filled every human on every ship in the fleet. "Send the word to all fleets," she said, and her voice did not waver, and her eyes did not blink. "Prometheus is active. All commands to war footing. All reserves to immediate deployment. All civilian evacuation protocols for border worlds to begin within the hour." Park saluted and turned to the communications array, and within minutes, the signal was racing across human space at faster-than-light speed, reaching every colony, every station, every ship, every listening post, and every human heart that had ever wondered if this day would come. And across the galaxy, in a palace carved from the bones of a dead moon, High Sovereign Jalvor received word that the humans had refused his ultimatum, and for the first time in 900 years, he felt something he did not recognize. Not concern, not quite, but a flicker of uncertainty, a small, cold whisper in the back of his ancient mind that said perhaps this would not be as simple as he had assumed. Because he had conquered hundreds of species, and none of them had ever posed a real threat. And these humans were the youngest and smallest of them all. "Mobilize the war fleet," he commanded, his voice like grinding stone. "Show them what happens to those who defy the hegemony." And so the fleets began to move, and so the war began, and so the galaxy leaned forward to watch what it believed would be a slaughter. They were right about that much. It would be a slaughter. They were simply wrong about who would be doing the slaughtering. On Earth, in cities and towns and villages across every continent, people looked up at the night sky and knew that somewhere out there, among the cold and distant stars, their children and brothers and sisters and friends were preparing to fight for them, and something ancient stirred in the human spirit, something that had carried them through ice ages and plagues and world wars and every kind of darkness the universe had ever thrown at them. They were not afraid. They were furious. And fury, as the galaxy was about to learn, was something humans understood better than anyone. The Draven Warfleet jumped into the Argos system, expecting to find a terrified colony begging for mercy. And what they found instead was nothing at all. And that nothing was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. 12,000 capital ships, each one the size of a mountain, bristling with weapons that could crack a continent in half, emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation around the planet Argos, and their sensors swept the world below and found empty cities, silent streets, dark buildings, and not a single living human anywhere. 13 million people had lived on Argos just 6 days ago, and now they were gone. Every man, every woman, every child, every pet, every family photograph and personal belonging that could be carried. All of it evacuated in less than a week to ships waiting beyond the system's edge. And the Draven fleet commander, a veteran named Kralden, who had conquered 11 worlds in his career, stared at the empty planet on his display and felt the first cold touch of doubt. No species had ever evacuated a world that fast. It was not supposed to be possible. And yet the humans had done it as if they had practiced it. As if they had planned for exactly this moment. As if every transport ship and cargo hauler and civilian vessel in their fleet had known precisely where to go and what to carry and how fast to move. Because they had. Because Contingency Prometheus had included evacuation protocols for every single colony world, updated every year for over a century, drilled in secret so that when the day came, 13 million people could disappear like smoke in the wind. Kralden ordered his fleet to take orbit and secure the planet, and that was his second mistake, because his first mistake had been coming here at all. The moment the Draven fleet settled into formation around the empty world, the Argos system came alive. It started with the asteroids, thousands of them drifting in the outer belt, unremarkable, ignored by Draven sensors because they were just rocks, except they were not just rocks. They were weapons platforms, built in secret over decades, buried inside hollowed-out stone, and covered with sensor-dampening material. And now they woke up all at once, and the darkness of space lit up with the fire of 10,000 missiles streaking toward the Draven fleet. Kralden shouted orders, but before his ships could react, the second wave hit. Autonomous minds that had been sleeping in the void for years activated and began moving, intelligent and hungry, seeking out the largest ships and detonating against their hulls in bursts of white-hot plasma. And then came the gravitational disruption fields, hidden generators that twisted the fabric of space itself, pulling Draven ships out of formation, scrambling their navigation, turning their perfect battle lines into chaos. And then, while the Draven were reeling and burning and trying to understand what was happening, the United Stellar Navy arrived. Not a few hundred ships, not the token defense force that the Draven had expected, but 4,000 warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a single coordinated jump, arriving in perfect formation like a fist closing around the enemy fleet, and every single one of them was a ship that the galaxy had never seen before. They had been built in secret, in shipyards hidden inside hollowed-out moons, orbiting gas giants, in construction bays buried beneath the ice of frozen worlds, in facilities so deep inside asteroid fields that no satellite or spy probe had ever found them. And they were not like the old human ships that the galaxy knew about, the small patrol craft and cargo escorts that everyone had dismissed as primitive. These were warships, designed from the ground up for one purpose, and that purpose was to kill anything that threatened humanity, fast, and they were brutal. And they were armed with weapons that human engineers had spent 100 years perfecting in silence. Admiral Corin Vasquez stood on the bridge of her flagship, the USN Prometheus, and watched the tactical display light up with the chaos of battle. And she gave her orders with the calm, steady voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 10,000 times in simulations. All wings engage, wolf formation, target their command ships first, blind their communications, and do not let a single one of them regroup. The battle that followed would later be called the Battle of Argos, and it would become the most studied military engagement in galactic history, not because of its size, but because of what it revealed about the species that fought it. Human ships moved in ways that alien tacticians had never seen, fast, aggressive, almost reckless, weaving through enemy fire with a coordination that seemed impossible. was because it was driven not by computer automation, but by human instinct, by the same pack-hunting intelligence that had once let their ancestors bring down creatures 10 times their size on the plains of Africa. They fought in teams of 3. 2 ships would draw fire, while the third struck from an angle the enemy did not expect. And they changed tactics constantly, adapting in real time to every move the Draven made. Because humans were not like the Draven, who followed rigid battle doctrines perfected over centuries. Humans improvised. Humans invented. Humans looked at a losing situation and found a way to win it that no one had ever thought of before. And then came the boarding parties. When human marines in powered armor launched themselves across the void between ships and cut their way into Draven vessels with plasma torches and breaching charges, the Draven crews did not know what to do, because no species had boarded an enemy ship in over 2,000 years. It was considered suicidal, insane, a relic of a barbaric age. But the humans did it anyway, storming through corridors with weapons blazing, taking engine rooms and bridge decks in brutal close-quarters combat that the Draven were completely unprepared for. 800 light-years away, on a Velori listening post hidden in the nebula of Saren's Eye, an intelligence officer named Tal Shiren sat in front of her monitoring station and watched the battle data streaming in from Argos, and her 4 hands trembled as the numbers scrolled past, because she had studied humans for 15 years, and she had written papers about their potential, and she had warned her superiors that they were not what they appeared to be, and nobody had listened, and now the proof was burning across her screen in real time. "Commander," she said to her superior, her voice barely above a whisper, "they were not unprepared. They were waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time, and they built all of this in secret, and nobody knew." Her commander, a tall Velori male named Sevarin, leaned over her shoulder and stared at the display and said nothing for a long time, because the numbers did not lie. The Draven were losing, and they were not losing slowly. They were losing fast, faster than anyone had thought possible. In 11 hours, it was over. The Draven lost 1,800 ships at Argos, 1,800 capital warships destroyed or disabled or captured, along with tens of thousands of crew, and the rest of their fleet, battered and bleeding, did something that no Draven fleet had ever done in the entire history of their empire. They retreated. Kral Den ordered the withdrawal himself, and when he sent his report to the High Sovereign, his words were simple and stunned. They were ready for us. They knew we were coming. They had weapons we have never seen. We cannot take this system. We need reinforcements. We need time. We need to rethink everything. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Vasquez watched the Draven fleet disappear into faster-than-light travel, fleeing back toward their own space, and she allowed herself one slow breath, just one, before turning to her officers. "Do not celebrate," she said quietly. "This was the first battle, not the last. They will come back with more ships and more anger, and the next time will be harder. Enjoy this moment, remember it, and then get back to work. Has only just begun." And far away, in his palace on the dead moon, High Sovereign Zaelvor read the battle report from Argos, and his advisors gathered around him like shadows, and one of them, a general named Thalmec, said the words that hung in the air like poison. "They fight like they have nothing to lose, my sovereign." Zaelvor turned his ancient eyes on the general, and corrected him with a voice that was colder than the void between stars. "No, they fight like they have everything to lose, and that is far worse. A creature with nothing to lose is reckless, but a creature protecting what it loves is relentless, and relentless enemies are the ones that destroy empires." He paused, and for just a moment, the High Sovereign of the most powerful empire in the galaxy looked uncertain. "We may have made a mistake," he said softly, and no one in the room dared to agree with him out loud, but every single one of them was thinking the same thing. Galaxy had poked a sleeping beast, and now the beast was awake, and its eyes were open, and its teeth were bared, and it was not going back to sleep. 3 months into the war, the Galaxy began to understand something that terrified it far more than any weapon or warship. Humanity was not just fighting a war. Humanity had become a war, and there was no part of their civilization that had not transformed itself into an instrument of victory. On Earth, and across all 38 colony worlds, the change happened so fast that alien observers could barely track it, because within weeks of the Battle of Argos, human society had undergone a total conversion that no other species in galactic history had ever attempted or even imagined. Factories that had been building cars and furniture and children's toys were now building missile components and armor plating and drone cores, and the workers inside them had not been forced or ordered. They had volunteered, every single one of them, lining up at shift changes with the same grim determination that burned in the eyes of the soldiers on the front lines, shut down their normal classes and opened weapons research labs. And professors who had spent their lives studying poetry and philosophy and ancient history now turned their minds to electronic warfare and shield harmonics and the weak points of Draven hull construction, because humans did not separate their thinkers from their fighters the way other species did. To humans, every mind was a weapon, and every hand was a tool, and every beating heart was fuel for the machine. Farmers doubled their output to feed the fleet, working their fields from dawn until long after dark, and when they ran out of hands, their neighbors came to help, and when the neighbors ran out of time, their children came, and no one complained, and no one asked for payment, because this was not about money or duty. This was about survival, and humans understood survival the way fish understood water. Artists painted murals on the sides of buildings, vast images of soldiers and ships and the blue-green Earth hanging in the darkness of space, and musicians wrote songs that played on every radio frequency across human space. Songs that made people stand a little taller, and clench their fists a little harder, and remember what they were fighting for. And these were not empty propaganda pieces created by a government ministry. These were the honest, raw cries of a species that had been pushed to the edge and had chosen to push back. Retired veterans who had served in peacetime navies dusted off their uniforms and reported to recruiting stations. And teenagers who were too young to enlist lied about their ages. And mothers who had never held a weapon learned to operate point defense turrets on orbital stations. And grandfathers who could barely walk taught young cadets how to read star charts and calculate jump coordinates. The Draven hegemony watched all of this and did not understand it, because in their civilization, war was the business of the warrior caste. Civilians stayed home, factories produced what the military ordered, and society continued as normal, while the soldiers fought and died on the front lines. And it had always worked. And it had always been enough. But this was something else entirely. Something that Draven had no word for. Something that made their strategists stare at intelligence reports with a growing sense of unease. Because how do you fight an enemy when every single member of their species is the enemy? When there is no civilian population to threaten, no economy to disrupt, no morale to break, because the population is the army. And the economy is the war machine, and the morale comes from a place so deep inside the human spirit that no force in the universe can reach it. Admiral Vasquez understood this better than anyone, and she used it, launching the operation she had been planning since the day the war began. Operation Hammerfall, a coordinated three-front offensive, targeting not then Draven fleet but their supply lines, because Vasquez knew something that most alien commanders did not. Wars are not won by the side with the most ships. Wars are won by the side that can keep fighting the longest. Human strike groups hit Draven supply convoys in 3 different sectors simultaneously. And the attacks were not the kind of brute force assaults that the Draven expected. They were precise, surgical, almost elegant, hitting fuel depots and ammunition stores and communication relays while leaving the warships untouched, because a warship without fuel is just a very expensive rock. And Vasquez wanted the Draven to have plenty of useless rocks. When the Draven did manage to catch human ships, the results were even more disturbing, because human crews did not behave the way other species behaved when they were cornered. They did not surrender, they did not flee, they fought with everything they had, and when their weapons were spent, into the enemy at full speed, trading one human vessel for one Draven vessel in a final act of defiance that left Draven commanders horrified. Human engineers captured Draven technology from disabled ships and reverse-engineered it in days. Shield generators, propulsion systems, sensor arrays, things that should have taken decades to understand, were stripped apart and rebuilt and improved and sent back to the front lines within weeks, because human engineers did not follow the careful, methodical processes that other species used. They tore things apart with their bare hands and figured out how they worked by breaking them and building them again, and they did it with a speed that bordered on madness. And on the ground, when human marines were surrounded and outnumbered and cut off from retreat, they did not lay down their weapons. They dug into the dirt and the rock, and they made the enemy pay for every meter in blood, fighting with rifles and knives and fists and teeth if they had to. And every time the Draven thought they had finally broken a human position, they would find that the humans had fallen back to a second position, and a third, and a fourth, because humans had been fighting desperate last stands since before they left their own planet, and they were very, very good at it. It was during this time that Tal Shi-Ren, the Valori intelligence officer who had watched the Battle of Argos unfold from her listening post, completed the document that would change the galaxy's understanding of humanity forever. She called it On the Nature of Human War, and she submitted it to the Valori High Council as a classified intelligence assessment. And when the council members read it, several of them had to stop and sit down, because their legs would not hold them. The report said this: humans do not treat war the way other species do. They do not view it as a profession or a necessity or even a tragedy. They view it as a transformation, a fundamental change in the nature of their entire civilization. And when this transformation occurs, every human becomes a part of the war effort in ways that are difficult to comprehend. The farmer becomes a supplier, the teacher becomes a trainer, the artist becomes a propagandist, the scientist becomes a weapon maker, and the child becomes a reason to fight harder. There is no part of human society that remains untouched, no individual who stands apart, no voice that says, "This is not my problem." They have done this before, to each other, many times throughout their history, and they have become terrifyingly efficient at it. We have made a terrible error in allowing anyone to provoke them into showing us what they are capable of. The report was supposed to remain classified, but within days it had leaked to every intelligence service in the Concord, and within weeks the phrase, "on the nature of human war," had become the most whispered words in galactic diplomacy. And the whispers led to action, quiet action, hidden action. Species that had remained neutral began sending supplies to human space, not openly, not officially, but through back channels and unmarked cargo ships and diplomatic pouches. Because the galaxy was beginning to realize that if the Draven won this war, they would be emboldened beyond anyone's ability to control, and if the humans lost, there would be no one left willing to stand up to tyranny. Ambassador Okonkwo, who had returned to Earth after his final speech at the Concord, received reports of these secret shipments and allowed himself a small, tired smile, because he had spent 23 years trying to convince the galaxy to stand with humanity. And now they were finally doing it. Not because they believed in justice, but because they were afraid of what would happen if justice lost. He understood their cowardice, and he accepted their help anyway, because humanity could not afford pride right now. Humanity could only afford to win. And then came the moment that turned the tide not just of the war, but of galactic opinion forever. Okonkwo was invited to address the Galactic Concord one more time, not as a petitioner begging for help, but as a representative of a species that had done what no one else had dared to do. And he stood at the podium in that vast silent hall and looked out at 4,000 species and said the words that would be carved into the stone of history. You told us we were young. Not understand how the galaxy works. And you were right. We did not understand. We did not understand how you could watch the innocent suffer and do nothing. We did not understand how you could let fear make your decisions for you. We did not understand how the greatest civilizations in the galaxy could be so afraid of one bully that they would sacrifice everything they claimed to believe in. You were right that we did not understand, and we still do not, because we refuse to. We will fight this war with or without you, and when it is over, the galaxy will have to decide what kind of future it wants, one built on fear, or one built on the simple idea that no one has the right to kneel another. The chamber was silent for a long time after he finished, and then, one by one, delegates began to stand. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough to send a signal that echoed across the stars like a bell. The tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the Draven hegemony felt it too, and for the first time in their long and bloody history, they were not sure they could stop it. 8 months into the war, the Draven hegemony began to crack, and the cracks did not come from human warships or human weapons. They came from something far more dangerous, something that no fleet could stop and no weapon could destroy, because the cracks came from hope, and hope, once it takes root in the hearts of the oppressed, spreads like fire for dry grass. It started on a world called Kethos Prime, deep inside Draven-controlled space, where a species called the Kethali had been enslaved for over 600 years. 600 years of forced labor in the mines and factories that built the Draven war machine. 600 years of broken bodies and stolen children, and a slow grinding despair that had crushed every spark of resistance out of them, generation after generation. But then the war broadcasts reached them. Admiral Vasquez had opened a second front, not with ships, but with signals, broadcasting across every frequency that could reach. Draven occupied space, and the broadcasts were not threats or propaganda in the way the Draven understood those things. They were something else entirely, something the Draven had never thought to guard against. They were stories, human stories, the revolutions and uprisings and liberation movements that filled human history like stars filled the sky. The story of slaves who broke their chains and marched to freedom. The story of colonies that defied empires and won their independence. The story of ordinary people who stood in front of tanks and refused to move. The story of walls that fell and tyrants that crumbled and nations that rose from the ashes of oppression to build something better. And the Kethali watched these broadcasts in the darkness of their barracks, huddled around stolen receivers, and for the first time in 600 years, they saw something they had forgotten was possible. They saw a species that had been told to kneel and had said no. Species that was younger and smaller and weaker than their masters, and yet was fighting and winning. And the thought that burned through their minds like lightning was this: if the young ones can bleed for freedom, so can we. The uprising on Kethos Prime began at dawn on a day that the Kethali would later call the first morning, and it spread to 2 more industrial worlds within 48 hours, and within a week, the entire Kethali labor force, millions of workers who kept the Draven war factories running, had laid down their tools and picked up whatever they could find that could be used as a weapon. They were not soldiers, and they did not fight like soldiers. They fought like what they were, which was people who had been pushed past the point of endurance, and they died in terrible numbers, but they did not stop, because they had seen the human broadcasts, and they knew that freedom was worth dying for, and they would rather die on their feet than live another day on their knees. And the Kethali were not the only ones. Across Draven space, a dozen enslaved species began to stir, began to whisper, began to look at each other with new eyes, because the broadcasts kept coming, relentless and unstoppable. And every story they told was another crack in the foundation of the hegemony. And the Draven could not stop the signal, because it came from everywhere and nowhere. And you cannot kill a radio wave with a warship. The Draven rear territories descended into chaos. Supply lines that had fed the front collapsed as slave workers sabotaged shipyards and burned fuel depots and destroyed communication relays. And the great war machine that had conquered 1,000 worlds began to choke on its own cruelty. Because an empire built on the backs of slaves can only survive as long as the slaves are too afraid to fight back. And the slaves were not afraid anymore. High Sovereign Vor watched his empire begin to unravel, something he had not felt in 900 years. Rage, true rage, the kind that clouds judgment and demands blood. Because this was not supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. The humans were supposed to be a minor nuisance, a quick conquest, a lesson to the galaxy about the price of defiance, and instead they had become an infection, a disease that was rotting his empire from the inside out. And so Vor made the decision that would define the final chapter of the war. He ordered the deployment of the Shanvek, the ancient weapon that the Draven had built centuries ago and never used, a gravitational implosion device capable of crushing a planet into a ball of dead matter the size of a fist. And he aimed it at Earth. His logic was simple and savage. If he destroyed the human homeworld, the source of their strength and spirit and identity, the humans would shatter, their morale would collapse, their fleet would fragment, and the enslaved species would be broken. That had risen up would see that defiance leads only to annihilation, and would crawl back to their chains. The weapon was loaded onto a massive carrier ship, surrounded by a fleet of 3,000 warships. And they began their long jump toward Sol, toward the small blue planet that had given birth to the most stubborn species the galaxy had ever known. But Vor had not counted on Tal Shiren. The Valori intelligence officer had been monitoring Draven communications for months, quietly and illegally, because her government had ordered strict neutrality, and she had decided, in the privacy of her own conscience, that neutrality in the face of genocide was not a virtue, but a crime. When she intercepted the orders for the Shanvek deployment, she did not hesitate. She did not consult her superiors. She did not file a report through proper channels. She did not waste a single second on the bureaucratic procedures that would have delayed the information by hours or days that humanity did not have. She transmitted the intelligence directly to Admiral Vasquez on a coded frequency that she had set up months ago for exactly this kind of emergency. And then she sat back in her chair and closed her eyes and knew that she had just committed treason against her own government, and she did not care, because some things mattered more than laws and orders and the comfortable fiction of neutrality. When the data reached the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Vasquez read it 3 times, and each time her face grew more still, and each time the weight of command pressed down on her shoulders a little harder, because the intelligence presented her with an impossible choice. She could pull her entire fleet back to defend Earth and save her homeworld, but that would mean abandoning the offensive, giving up the ground they had gained, and allowing the Draven to regroup and recover and rebuild their supply lines, and then the war would grind on for years or decades, and millions more would die. Or she could split her fleet, send half to defend Earth, and take the other half on a strike directly at the Draven throne world, hitting the heart of the hegemony while its best ships were on their way to Sol. But splitting the fleet meant that both forces would be weaker, that both battles would be harder, that the margin for error would be razor thin, and that she might lose everything on both fronts. She stood alone in her quarters for 1 hour, staring at a photograph of Earth that she kept on her desk. A photograph taken from orbit that showed the blue oceans and white clouds and green continents of the world where she had never lived but had always called home, and she made her decision. She would split the fleet. She called her senior commanders to the bridge, and she told them the plan, and she watched their faces as they absorbed the reality of what she was asking. And then she said the words that would carry them through the fire that was coming. The Draven want to break our home because they think that if they break the place, they break the people. But they do not understand us. They have never understood us. Earth is not just a planet. It is not just soil and water and air. Earth is an idea. It is the idea that a species born in the mud of a small world can reach the stars and stand among gods and refuse to bow. And you cannot kill an idea, not with a weapon, not with a fleet, not with all the power in the universe. We carry home inside us every ship, every soldier, every beating heart, and where we stand, there stands Earth. The fleet divided. 2,000 ships turned back toward Sol under the command of Vice Admiral Chen Wei, a quiet and methodical man who had spent his career in defensive operations and who loved Earth the way a gardener loves a garden, with patience and care and a willingness to fight anything that threatened it. Ships, led by Vasquez herself, aboard the Prometheus, set course for the Draven throne world, for the ancient palace on the dead moon, for the heart of the empire that had started this war and was about to learn how it would end. As the two fleets jumped to faster-than-light travel, heading in opposite directions across the galaxy, Tal Shi-Ren sat in her listening post and watched the signal tracks diverge on her display. And she whispered a prayer in the Vailori language, not to any god, because the Vailori did not believe in gods, but to the universe itself, asking it to be kind to the brave and merciless to the cruel. And the galaxy held its breath, because everyone who was watching, and everyone was watching, knew that the next hours would decide not just the fate of humanity, but the fate of every species that had ever dreamed of being free. 2 battles were coming, 2 storms converging on 2 worlds at the opposite ends of the galaxy. Battles would echo through history for 10,000 years. The Draven planet killer raced toward Earth. Vasquez raced toward the Draven throne, and between them, in the vast cold silence of space, the future of everything hung by a thread so thin that a whisper could snap it. The Draven planet killer fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, 3,000 warships surrounding the massive carrier that held the Shanvek device. And from their bridges, the Draven commanders could see it. The small blue planet hanging in the darkness like a jewel, the birthplace of the species that had dared to defy the greatest empire in the galaxy. They expected to find it undefended, or at best defended by a token force that would crumble under the weight of 3,000 ships. But what they found instead made even the most hardened Draven veteran pause. Vice Admiral Chen Wei had positioned humanity's home guard across every approach to Earth. Older warships pulled from reserve fleets, orbital defense stations that had been built in secret around every planet and moon in the system. Civilian cargo vessels retrofitted with weapons and armor plating by engineers who had worked without sleep for days, equipped with modified drilling lasers that could cut through Draven hull metal. And behind all of that, the planet itself, where 2 billion people looked up at the sky and refused to be afraid. The battle began at 1400 hours Earth Standard Time, and it was the most brutal engagement of the entire war. Chen Wei knew he was outgunned and outmatched, and he did not try to win through firepower. He tried to win through time, through stubbornness, through the simple human refusal to die when dying was the logical thing to do. Because every minute he held the line, was a minute that Vasquez's fleet was getting closer to the Draven throne world, and if Vasquez succeeded, none of the rest would matter. The Home Guard fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Ships crewed by volunteers, people who had been teachers and engineers and doctors and shopkeepers a year ago, held their positions against professional Draven warships and refused to retreat. Their ships were crippled, they kept firing, and when their weapons failed, they rammed their burning hulks into enemy vessels. And when they had nothing left, they broadcast defiance on open channels so that everyone in the system and everyone in the galaxy could hear that humanity was still fighting. The losses were terrible. Hundreds of human ships burned and broke apart in the darkness above Earth, and thousands of people died in the cold vacuum of space. And Chen Wei watched each death on his tactical display and felt every one of them like a wound. But he did not flinch, and he did not waver, because the people who were not dying for nothing. They were dying for the planet behind them, and for every person on it, and for the idea that some things are worth more than survival. And then the Draven launched the Shanvek, the planet-killer device, separated from its carrier ship, and began its acceleration toward Earth, a dark sphere of ancient technology that pulsed with gravitational energy, and every sensor in the system locked onto it, and every heart in the fleet stopped beating for one terrible second. Chen Wei gave the order to intercept, and a dozen ships broke formation and raced toward the device, firing everything they had, but the Shanvek was shielded by a gravitational field that deflected their weapons like rain off stone, and one by one the intercepting ships were destroyed by the Draven escorts surrounding the device. And then there was the Defiance. The USN Defiance was a destroyer, small and fast, and already badly damaged from the battle. Half its weapons were gone, its port engine was dead, and fires burned in 3 decks. And its captain was a woman named Lena Cho, who had been a school teacher in Seoul before the war, a woman who taught children about history and literature and the power of stories. A woman who had enlisted the day after the Draven ultimatum because she believed that some stories had to be lived and not just told. Commander Cho looked at her tactical display and saw the Shanvek accelerating toward Earth, and she saw that no other ship was close enough to intercept, and she saw the gap in the Draven escort screen where 2 ships had peeled off to engage another target, and she saw the trajectory that would take her ship directly into the path of the device, and she made her decision in less than a heartbeat. She opened the ship-wide channel, and her voice was steady and warm, the same voice she had used to read stories to her students on quiet afternoons. And she said, "All non-essential crew to escape pods. You have 90 seconds. This is not a request. It has been the honor of my life to serve with you. Now go." 63 crew members made it to the escape pods, and 12 stayed behind. 12 volunteers who looked at their captain and refused to leave. And she did not order them again, because she understood. Because she was human. They were human, and humans do not leave each other behind. The Defiance surged forward on its one remaining engine, burning through the gap in the escort screen, taking hit after hit from Draven weapons, losing armor and hull plating and atmosphere, and still it kept coming. A broken, burning arrow aimed at the heart of the weapon that would kill their world. At the last moment, as the Defiance closed to point-blank range, Commander Cho overloaded the ship's reactor core, and the resulting detonation was a sun being born in the darkness, a white-hot sphere of plasma that engulfed the Shanvek and overwhelmed its gravitational shields and tore the ancient device apart in a storm of fire and light. The planet killer was destroyed, and Earth survived, and Lena Cho and her 12 volunteers became the most honored dead in human history. Her last transmission, recorded and broadcast across the galaxy, was 6 words, spoken in the voice of a teacher who had found the greatest lesson of her life. "Tell my students I taught well." And at the other end of the galaxy, Admiral Vasquez's strike fleet arrived at the Draven throne world. The Draven home fleet was gutted. Too many ships had been sent to Sol. Too many others were scattered across the Empire, trying to contain the slave uprisings that were now burning on dozens of worlds. And when 2,000 human warships appeared in orbit around the ancient palace of the High Sovereign, the remaining Draven defenders knew that the war was over. But Admiral Vasquez did not do what the Draven expected. She did not bomb the planet. She did not burn the cities. She did not unleash the same kind of destruction that the Draven had tried to bring to Earth. And this was the moment that changed everything. Not just the war, but the soul of the galaxy itself. Because every species was watching. Every eye and sensor and receiver in the Concorde was locked onto this moment. Humanity would prove that they were just another conquering species wearing the mask of righteousness. Vasquez opened a channel on all frequencies, and her voice reached every ship and every world and every listening post in range, and she said this. "This is Admiral Corin Vasquez of the United Stellar Navy. We are not here to destroy you. We are here to end this. Your sovereign sent a weapon to murder our world, and we could do the same to yours, and every soul in this galaxy knows it. We choose not to, not because we are weak, not because we cannot, but because this is who we are. This is who we have always been, even when we did not live up to it, even when we failed, even when our own history shames us. We are the species that believes in second chances. So here is yours. Surrender your government, release your slave species, accept the judgment of the galaxy for what you have done, or we will dismantle your empire piece by piece, not with cruelty, but with the savagery. Same patience we showed for 200 years, while we waited for someone to do the right thing. We are done waiting. The choice is yours." The silence lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the longest 4 minutes in galactic history. And then, one by one, Draven warships began to power down their weapons. High Sovereign Zaelvor was removed from his throne by his own military council. Officers who had served him for centuries, but who could see the truth that he could not. That the war was lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of every species in the galaxy. Because the slave uprisings would never stop now, and the Concorde would never look away again. And the universe had changed in a way that could not be unchanged. The Draven hegemony surrendered, and the war was over. And across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds, people of 100 different species looked up at their skies and breathed the first free breath they had taken in centuries. In the months that followed, the Galactic Concorde was reformed, rebuilt from the ground up, with a new charter that humanity had insisted upon: mutual defense, the abolition of conquest, the rights of all sentient beings, and a promise that never again would the galaxy stand by and watch while the strong devoured the weak. Humanity did not seek to rule, they never had. They only asked that the galaxy be better than it had been. And for the first time in 10,000 years, it was. Tal Shi-Ren was asked by a journalist what she believed the galaxy had learned from the war. And she sat quietly for a long moment before answering. "We learned that humans were never the ones we should have feared. We should have feared what the galaxy would become if we forced them to show us who they really are." Ambassador Okonkwo retired to a small house on the coast of Lagos, where the sound of the ocean reminded him that some things endured no matter what the universe threw at them. And one afternoon a young alien exchange student knocked on his door and asked him why humanity had fought so hard, and the old diplomat smiled and said simply, "Because someone had to." Admiral Vasquez returned to Earth and visited the memorial wall that had been built in the gardens of the old United Nations building, a wall that held the names of every human who had died in the war, thousands upon thousands of names carved in black stone. And she found the name she was looking for and placed her hand against it and whispered, "We made it, Lena. All of us. We made it." And in schools across human space, teachers told their students the story of Commander Lena Cho, the teacher from Seoul who had given the greatest lesson anyone could give. That courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. The galaxy had made a fatal mistake, and the mistake was not that they had underestimated humanity's ships or soldiers or weapons. The mistake was simpler and deeper and older than any of that. They had forgotten that the most dangerous creature in the universe is not the one with the sharpest claws or the biggest fleet or the most ancient empire. It is the one that fights for something worth more than its own life. Humanity did not go to war for territory or power or revenge. They went to war for the idea that no one, no species, no empire, no force in all the stars has the right to put another on its knees. And that idea, once spoken, once fought for, once paid for in blood and fire and sacrifice, could never be taken back, could never be silenced, could never be extinguished. It would burn forever, bright and stubborn and defiant, like humanity itself.